Ancient Greece was in many ways a pretty amazing place. It was the birthplace of democracy, home to many architectural wonders. The philosophy of Aristotle and Plato helped push the boundaries of how we understood the world. Math and science flourished, and so did theater and the arts. But it also had a seedy underbelly that isn't talked about so often, and rulers who were less savory than many people think. Let's dive into some of these filthy secrets. Alexander the Not-So-Great. Let's say you're out on a date. It's going well at first. You could even say it's going great. Your date is interesting, ambitious, smart, charismatic. But the more you get to know the person, the more you realize something is terribly wrong. This is kind of what happens when you dive into the biography of Alexander the Great. Or should I say Alexander the Not-So-Great? Please, save your laughter for the end. At its peak, Alexander the Great's empire spanned 3 continents, including Europe, Asia, and Africa, and covered an area of about 2 million square miles. It stretched from Greece in the west to parts of modern-day Pakistan in the east, and from Egypt in the south to the edge of the Persian Empire in the north. And he gobbled up all that territory in just 11 years, between 334 and 323 BC. Not too shabby. Alexander the Great was a brilliant tactician on the battlefield, and willing to take all kinds of risk in pursuit of victory. However, there are also many accounts of his ruthlessness towards his enemies, those who opposed him, and even his longtime friends. In his conquest, Alexander often used brutal tactics to subdue his opponents. For example, after conquering the city of Tyre in modern-day Lebanon, he had many of its residents wiped out, and the city was burned to the ground. In a similar way, after capturing the Persian city of Persepolis, Alexander allowed his soldiers to loot and pillage the entire metropolis, Viking style. There are also reports that Alexander executed some of his own generals who he believed were plotting against him, a pretty paranoid move, but one he apparently thought was necessary. He also had his childhood friend killed in a drunken argument. His friend Clytus, no, not Cletus, this one. Looks like there are not any good images of him, but we do have this illustration of what could have gone down between the two. Anyway, as I was saying, Clytus was a childhood friend of Alexander and had been with him since his early years. He was also one of Alexander's most trusted generals and fought alongside him in battles throughout the growing empire. According to some accounts, during an alcohol-fueled party in 328 BC, Clytus criticized Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and accused him of forgetting his Greek heritage. Alexander, who was known for his quick temper, became enraged and reportedly shouted, "What have I done to deserve these insults from you, who owe everything to me?" In the heat of the moment, Alexander drew his sword, killing him instantly. After the incident, Alexander is said to have been deeply remorseful for his actions, and some accounts even suggest that he attempted to take his own life. Classic Greek tragedy type of stuff. The incident is often cited as an example of Alexander's growing arrogance and his descent into megalomania. It is also seen as a turning point in his leadership style, as some historians believe that he became more paranoid and violent after the incident. The tragedy of Demosthenes. Next up, we have a man who is widely considered one of history's greatest public speakers and someone who gives a whole new meaning to having a mouthful of rocks, Demosthenes. Demosthenes was an ancient Greek orator and politician who lived during the 4th century BC. He was known for his stirring speeches and powerful rhetoric, skills our current politicians could perhaps learn to hone a bit more carefully. Demosthenes was born in Athens in 384 BC and came from a wealthy family. However, his father died when he was young, and he was left in the care of guardians who mismanaged his inheritance and left him with almost nothing. Maybe they invested everything in Blockbuster back in 2005. Whoops! As a result, Demosthenes was forced to become a professional orator in order to support himself. Despite suffering from a speech impediment, Demosthenes became one of the greatest orators of his time. He devoted himself to the study of rhetoric and worked tirelessly to improve his public speaking skills. He supposedly practiced speaking with pebbles in his mouth and to have recited speeches while running or walking up steep hills in order to improve his breath control. Try speaking with pebbles in your mouth. Difficult, isn't it? Demosthenes was also an active politician and was super opposed to the expansion of Macedonian power in Greece. He gave a series of famous speeches against King Philip II of Macedon, warning of the danger posed by his military campaigns. But his efforts were ultimately unsuccessful, and Philip defeated the Greek armies at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. Then along came the previously mentioned Alexander the Great, who took over Macedon in 336. Demosthenes hated this and continued to speak out publicly against Macedonian rule, becoming a leading figure in the anti-Macedonian movement in Athens. When Alexander the Great bit the bullet in 323 BC, Athens and other Greek city-states rose up against Macedonian rule. Demosthenes was among those who supported the rebellion and delivered speech after speech eloquently, giving the verbal middle finger to the Macedonians. But the rebellion was ultimately unsuccessful, and in 322 BC, the new Macedonian king Antipater defeated the Greek armies in the Battle of Cranon. Demosthenes, who had been forced into exile, fled to the temple of Poseidon on the island of Colorea, hoping to seek sanctuary there. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, when Demosthenes learned that the Macedonians were coming to capture him, he took poison and died. The poison he took could have been hemlock, the same poison that was used to execute Socrates. Demosthenes' death was a symbolic end to the era of Greek democracy and freedom. He had been a tireless advocate for Athenian democracy and had fought against the expansion of Macedonian power in Greece. His death marked the final defeat of the Greek city-states and the end of their independence. Afterwards, everyone in Greece began talking like they had pebbles in their mouth as an homage to the great orator of Athens. Plato's Mysteries. When we think of cults these days, we think of sketchy pseudo-religious leaders feeding bowls of spiked punch to a bunch of brainwashed followers who think their great leader will guide them to some afterlife full of aliens and flowers. But it was a little different back in ancient Greece. Cults were connected to the pantheon of gods. Cults back then were more like secret clubs that worshiped particular gods like Zeus or Apollo or Dionysus. Like a frat today, you had to be initiated into the cult, and initiation ceremonies varied depending on the particular god attached to the particular cult. The cult of Dionysus seemed like a particularly fun one to be a part of. Dionysus was the god associated with fertility, but was also the god of wine and pleasure. Fertility, wine, pleasure, they often go hand in hand, if you know what I mean. Initiation rituals and get-togethers often revolved around the ingestion of mind-altering substances to help their followers come to a deeper understanding of the divine and the mysteries of life and death. Some scholars have suggested that the cult of Dionysus may have used substances such as ergot, a fungus that grows on wheat, or kykeon, a beer or wine drink, which were both believed to have psychoactive properties and could induce altered states of consciousness. Others have argued that the cult's rituals and ceremonies, which often involve music, dance, and theater, were themselves enough to produce ecstatic experiences without the help of any other substances. Either way, it seemed like they had a good time while also pondering the mysteries of existence. Plato, the great Greek philosopher, was also pretty hip to the cults of his time. The one he was a part of was called the cult of Eleusinian Mysteries. The Eleusinian Mysteries were a series of religious rituals and ceremonies that were held annually at the sanctuary of Eleusis near Athens. The mysteries were dedicated to the goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone, and they were considered to be among the most important religious events in ancient Greece. We don't really know the exact nature of Eleusinian mysteries. The rituals and ceremonies were kept secret, and only those who had been initiated into them were allowed to participate. We do know some stuff about it, though. It is believed that the mysteries involved a series of initiation rites that culminated in a dramatic revelation or epiphany, a mushroom trip type of aha moment where the earth and the spirit spoke to you and let you know what's what. Plato's philosophical views were apparently heavily influenced by his experiences in the mysteries, particularly his belief in the immortality of the soul. In his famous dialogue, the Phaedo, Plato describes the last hours of Socrates' life and his conviction that the soul is immortal and continues to exist after death. This belief was informed by Plato's experiences in the mysteries, where he believed he had witnessed the soul's journey through death and rebirth. Plato was influenced by some other philosophical ideas that were associated with the mysteries too, particularly the concept of mystical union. This idea held that the initiate could achieve a state of mystical unity with the divine through the mysteries, and that this experience could reveal the true nature of reality. Plato believed that education shouldn't just focus on the acquisition of knowledge or skills, but also on the development of the soul, which he believed was the true essence of the human being, Heady stuff, but maybe our modern education systems could take a page or two out of Plato's book. Then again, we cannot allow students to emulate Plato's beliefs. Unsavory relationships. Social conventions and customs have changed over the centuries, among other things. A lot of things that were accepted as completely normal back in the day are looked back on now as bizarre, outrageous, nasty, or downright sinister. I mean, what would Plato have thought about algorithms and computer-generated text and images, or lobbyists, or the atomic bomb? Would he have been amazed, or would he have been terrified? But this next one just might be objectively gross, despite the fact that it was written and spoken about at length by many ancient Greeks as a vital practice that helped develop the intellectual, artistic, and politically aware culture of Greek society. Back in ancient Greece, there was a relationship between an adult male known as the Erastes, or lover, and an adolescent boy known as the Eromenos, or beloved, and it was socially accepted. This relationship was kind of like a form of mentorship or education, in which the Erastes would teach the Eromenos about the various aspects of adult life, including things like military training, civic duties, and philosophy. The practice was most common in ancient Athens, where it was considered to be an important aspect of the education and socialization of young boys. However, it was not accepted universally across Greece and was sometimes viewed as controversial or even taboo. The exact nature of this type of relationship in ancient Greece is a matter of debate among scholars, and the details still are not fully understood. Some scholars have suggested that some forms of illicit contact may have occurred between the Erastes and the Eromenos, while others have argued that these relationships were strictly non-intimate. Over the years, in ancient Greece, there were several prominent figures known to have been mentors to younger males. Alexander the Great had an Eronymos named Hephaestion. An Athenian general named Alcibiades also enjoyed the company of several Eromenoi during his lifetime. And then there's Plato. Plato had relationships with several young boys, including his beloved student, Dion of Syracuse. Like the practice itself, the exact nature of Plato's relationship with Dion is uncertain, but he wrote about it quite a bit. In Plato's dialogues, he often refers to the practice of these relationships, and he presents it as a means of educating and guiding young men. For example, in his Symposium, Plato represents a series of speeches in which various characters extol the virtues of love and beauty, and they describe the ideal relationship between Erastes and Eromenos as one of spiritual and intellectual guidance rather than physical desire. In any case, it's a controversial practice that certainly hasn't aged well. The blood reign of Cassander. We've already talked about Alexander the Not-So-Great, so let's get into his successor, Cassander the possibly even worse. Cassander technically wasn't Alexander's successor, but he managed to wiggle his way into power through some pretty cutthroat moves that would make a lot of people cringe. Cassander rose to power in the aftermath of Alexander's death in 323 BC, when he was appointed as regent for Alexander's son, Alexander IV, who at the time was still just a baby. At this point, Macedon was a mess. There was a political power vacuum, and lots of people were vying for control of the kingdom, despite the fact that Alexander IV was the rightful heir. Cassander saw the infant king as a potential threat to his own power, and he conspired with other powerful figures to have the child eliminated. Around 316 BC, Cassander had Alexander IV and his mother Roxana imprisoned in the city of Amphipolis. There were a few attempts to rescue them. The first came shortly after the mother and son were locked up. A general who served under Alexander the Great, named Polyperchon, led a coalition of forces against Cassander in an effort to free his deceased commander's family. But his forces were ultimately defeated, and Alexander IV and Roxana continued to languish in prison. Another attempt was made in 309 BC by a group of Alexander's former generals who hoped to rescue Roxana and Alexander IV and install the young king as the ruler of Macedon. Unfortunately, their plan was discovered by Cassander, who executed the conspirators and tightened his grip on power. In 309 BC, Roxana and Alexander IV were both executed, supposedly by order of the Macedonian assembly, but most likely just by Cassander, who had fashioned himself into quite the dictator. The execution of Alexander IV was seen as a heinous act even in the brutal and violent politics of ancient Greece, and it cemented Cassander's reputation as a ruthless and power-hungry leader. It also marked the end of the direct line of Alexander the Great's family and contributed to the political instability of the region in the following decades. Cassander declared himself king of Macedon in 305 BC, and everyone lived happily ever after.
Cassander's bloody biography didn't end with infanticide, though. As king, Cassander engaged in a number of military campaigns and political maneuvers in order to secure his position and expand his territory. He defeated several rival claimants to the throne, including Demetrius Poliorcetes and Antigonus Gonatas, and he established alliances with other regional powers in order to bolster his position. In addition to these military and political actions, Cassander was known for his harsh treatment of his subjects. He imposed heavy taxes on the Macedonian people, and he used violence and intimidation to suppress any opposition to his rule. He had a ruthless and authoritarian approach to governance, and he tried to maintain his power at any cost, like any true dictator would. His actions had a significant impact on the political and social landscape of ancient Greece, and his legacy remains controversial to this day. The Tyrant of Athens.
Next up, we have someone who could be considered one of the original benevolent dictators. Pisistratus, also known as the Tyrant of Athens, was a guy who did a lot of pretty good things for Athens, but was also known as a guy who loved to disseminate fake news and propaganda and be pretty ruthless and a bit of a dictator.
He lived during the 6th century BC. He was born into a wealthy and influential family, but his initial attempts to seize power were unsuccessful. He first tried to take control of Athens in 560 BC, but was defeated and exiled from the city. But Pisistratus returned to Athens in 546 BC with the help of an army of mercenaries, and he successfully seized control of the city. He ruled Athens as a tyrant for the next couple of decades. Rule was marked by violence and suppression of political opposition. According to ancient Greek sources, he used force and intimidation to establish and maintain his grip on power, and employed a bodyguard of armed men to protect himself and intimidate his opponents. In one famous story, Pisistratus staged a fake assassination attempt on himself, which he then used as a pretext to seize control of Athens. He reportedly wounded himself and his mules, and then had his supporters spread the rumor that his political rivals had attempted to assassinate him. This led to a popular outcry for Pisistratus to be installed as tyrant, which he then used to seize power. Once in control, Pisistratus used a whole lot of propaganda and censorship to control the flow of information in Athens. He reportedly established a state-run news service, which he used to disseminate his own propaganda and suppress dissenting views. Pisistratus was also known for his patronage of the arts and support for public works projects, which helped to improve Athens' economy and infrastructure. He relied heavily on the support of the lower classes and instituted a bunch of policies that were popular among the masses. He provided loans to farmers and encouraged the cultivation of new crops, which helped boost the economy. He was also apparently a patron to Homer, the Homer of Iliad and Odyssey fame, and commissioned the first ever written versions of the epics. So, when we think about this guy, we have to balance a bit of tyranny and propaganda with a bit of economic reform and promotion of the arts. Like many historical figures, he was complex, and we should take the good with the bad.
The Mad Spartan King. Most people even vaguely aware of ancient Greek history have probably heard about King Leonidas and the Spartan 300. I mean, who doesn't get excited about a group of buff Spartan warriors launching spears at Xerxes and the Persians in a heroic last-ditch effort to stave off an invading army hundreds of times larger than their own? But the life and downfall of Leonidas' predecessor, Cleomenes I, was probably just as interesting, and probably a whole lot stranger.
Cleomenes I came to power during a time of instability in Sparta, and he quickly set about consolidating his authority. He launched a series of successful military campaigns against neighboring states that you probably never heard of, including Argos, Tegea, and Arcadia, which helped to establish Sparta as a dominant power in the region. Later, he would play a key part in the Greco-Persian Wars when he supported a Greek alliance against the invading Persian forces and led Spartan troops into a few pretty important battles, including the Battle of Thermopylae. Cleomenes was actually the co-ruler of Sparta with another guy named Demaratus. Both of their claims to the throne were disputed, but Demaratus had already been crowned king when Cleomenes, who was younger but more ambitious, challenged his right to the throne. According to the historian Herodotus, Cleomenes accused Demaratus of being illegitimate because his mother had been impregnated by a non-Spartan. He also claimed that Demaratus was mentally unstable and unfit to rule, an irony that we'll get to in a bit. Cleomenes then went to the Oracle of Delphi, the head priestess of a temple dedicated to Apollo and a person of supreme religious authority who was often consulted about important matters. According to some sources, he slipped her a bribe and the oracle confirmed that he was the rightful king. Demaratus still retained some support in Sparta, though, and was able to hold on to the throne for a bit, but he was eventually deposed and exiled by Cleomenes, who became the sole king of Sparta. Cleomenes then went about reforming Spartan society in a few ways. One of his most significant reforms was the redistribution of land to the citizens. Believe it or not, Sparta society was based on a system of land ownership, and the aristocracy had most of it. Funny how things change, or don't. Cleomenes gave a lot of land to the common people, which helped to weaken the power of the aristocracy. He also introduced a new law code that replaced the old system of laws, which had been used based on oral tradition. The new law code was written down and made public, which helped to make sure that the laws were applied fairly and equally to everyone. Cleomenes also tried to limit the power of the ephors, who were the magistrates responsible for enforcing the laws in Sparta. He tried to transfer some of their power to the kings, but this led to a conflict between him and the ephors and ultimately helped speed up his downfall. All the wealthy people who saw their land and power slipping away didn't like what was going on. Cleomenes was accused of being insane and was exiled from Sparta. According to the historian Herodotus, Cleomenes I tried to seek refuge in a temple dedicated to Athena, but was dragged out by his opponents and locked up in a nearby building. There, he apparently lost his mind and attempted to take his own life by beating his head against the walls and cutting off his own flesh. Eventually, some of his allies were able to step in and prevent him from finishing the job. Thoroughly out of his mind by this point, he then sought refuge with the Persian king, who reportedly offered to help him regain his throne. But nothing would come of it. Cleomenes was eventually betrayed by the Persians and died in captivity, although Plutarch mentions that he might have taken his own life by setting fire to his own house. The other mad Spartan king.
I see you're one crazy Spartan king named Cleomenes and raise you a second crazy Spartan king named Cleomenes. Cleomenes III ruled Sparta a few centuries after the first, from 235 to 222 BC. During the early years of his reign, Cleomenes III implemented a series of reforms aimed at strengthening Spartan society and military power. And like his early predecessor, he was no stranger to doling out bribes.
One example was his attempt to bribe members of the Council of Ephors, the aforementioned Spartan magistrates, in order to secure their support for his political reforms. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, Cleomenes used the treasure of Sparta to bribe members of the council, promising them a share of the spoils if they'd support his reforms. But his actions were discovered and he was forced to flee the city, but was later recalled to stand trial. He was found guilty and went into exile. During this time, maybe before exile, maybe after, but at some point, Cleomenes started to lose it. He had marbles rattling around in his skull. His behavior became increasingly erratic and delusional. He apparently became fascinated with religion and claimed to have had personal interactions with the gods. Plutarch wrote about a time when Cleomenes claimed to have received a message from the god Apollo through an oracle. In response to this message, Cleomenes began to perform strange religious rituals and made offerings to Apollo in his own name. He then began to think he was a god himself. He started wearing a crown of laurel leaves and insisted on being addressed as Zeus by his subjects. He also reportedly claimed to have the power to heal the sick and to bring the dead back to life. These behaviors were seen as evidence that Cleomenes was losing his marbles, and were used as a pretext by his political enemies to remove him from power.
He really did lose his marbles, didn't he?
Yeah, he lost them good.
Like his other namesake, Cleomenes I, Cleomenes III had also angered a lot of the Spartan elite, and despite bribing the ephors, he was also plotting to try to eliminate them completely. He was eventually forced to flee to Egypt, where he tried to gain support from King Ptolemy Euergetes, but it ultimately didn't work out. How this life ended is still unknown, but some say he took his own life, either by going to the gallows or by punching himself through the heart with a blade. It's eerie how much these two Cleomenes had in common. Was the name cursed? What other ancient Greek leaders do you want to know more about? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Nutty History.